my work has been done primarily either in partnership with school settings or alternative settings outside of school. And I'm mostly interested in how we can increase partnerships within these systems, but also ways to elevate and engage young people within these settings and think about strategies for increasing kind of authentic youth voice within these settings. And I've gotten to work in a number of different kind of alternative school settings as well as public school settings. And just based on our conversation from our first group, we thought we would maybe begin to have just a dialogue around how we initiate these partnerships and what are the thoughts, challenges, areas of entry, and thinking about how do we even begin to engage in the school ecosystem with regards to this. So I have a few slides kind of set up, I guess, like more just kind of thematically, but I would love to just kind of raise it as a dialogue within the group as well. So let me try and see if I remember my Zoom-ness here. Okay. Yeah, so I think the kind of the, and Adam and Sarah, please feel free to jump in here. But one of the big things I was thinking of kind of first with regards to beginning to develop these partnerships within school-based settings was this idea of ecological reconnaissance, which is kind of understanding before we even bridge partnerships between after-school settings, school settings, really having an understanding of kind of the political, social, and historical context of the school or larger district that you're hoping to partner with. And so some of the questions or ideas around that is like, what have they experienced in regards to funding or closures, the demographics of the community and student body. So what does this look like before even kind of beginning these partnerships here, understanding kind of the context for which we're going to begin to engage. And this can be done by engaging kind of archival research around these particular settings, having conversations with school administrators, as well as talking to other colleagues within the area. So that's one element there. And that was really huge for me first starting off working with schools, because I got my doctoral training at Michigan State in their ecological community program, and a lot of us were trying to engage in partnerships actually with the Detroit school district that has been kind of historically overstudied in these contexts. And so really understanding the ecology of the school and understanding what were pressing needs within the school was really kind of key to even making any entry in as well. And so that was another kind of key component that I always kind of thought about with regards to this work, is really understanding, well, what is the school's relationship with your particular institution? Have they partnered with other universities before? Were these partners equitable? Did they yield beneficial outcomes with regards to thinking about these relationships over time? What had an impact there when we think about these partnerships? Did they benefit the school, or were there kind of historic trauma that came with these partnerships? And do these institutions then hold these this role within the community, and how best can we understand this from a community psychology lens? Adam and Sarah, were there anything you wanted to add with that, or folks kind of on the call, any kind of prep work you do when you're engaging, even beginning to start thinking about school-based partnerships?
I can add an experience that I was just talking to a friend about recently when trying to engage with the school district. So I'm also currently a doctoral student at Michigan State. And as Mariah kind of mentioned, there's a lot of partnerships with Michigan State and outside school districts, but we're based kind of in the East Lansing area, and the Lansing School District is often kind of forgotten, I would say, by Michigan State. And so that has been just a historical context that we kind of, as a doctoral student, as my mentor, we kind of walked into. And so we did a lot of work of understanding the context and the existing data and like pretty much all of the like archival stuff that we could find about the district, but we didn't really know that that relationship or that kind of trust had been broken with the school district. And so when we had initially tried to approach working with the Lansing School District, there was a really big pushback as far as like, who are you? What are you doing? Why are you trying to work with us? And we had to really take a step back to do some of that relationship building with the school district. And I will say now we're in a much better place. We're actually we are actually writing a grant with the school district, our second grant in the fall. So it's gone a lot better, but taking the time to actually just build the interpersonal relationships, I think is just really critical.
And Jamie Lacordo added a chat saying, depending on who is doing the intervention, for example, school clinicians, teachers, I try and schedule a meeting with those folks in advance of applying for a grant to determine what are the important issues they want to target and if the idea regarding the intervention is feasible.
Yeah, no, I think those are really kind of important points to bring up. Does anyone else have any kind of thoughts they wanted to share as we kind of continue kind of talking about this? Are there any kind of key questions you always ask or think through when you're engaging in school sites?
This is Jean. I just like to emphasize making connections with more than one person or more than one group before you submit a grant. I had submitted a grant with a school district and had worked closely with the superintendent, and not the school board so much, but the superintendent and not the school board at all, but the superintendent and some teachers. And then the grant was funded, and over the summer, the superintendent suddenly passed away. And I had no connection to the school board, to the people that were replacing him. So I ended up having to it took about 7 or 8 months for me to find another school district. I had to go to a completely new school district. And I might have been able to avoid that if I had increased, if I had at least discussed it with the board so that they knew what was happening, because they didn't. The superintendent did, but the board didn't, and then I was left hanging.
Yeah, I think that's such a critical component there of how do you build a network of support when you're engaging in this work and just thinking about having different stakeholders. And I've definitely had a champion and then they have to be relocated or moving to a new school. And there's just so many things that kind of go up in the air. So I think that's another important component there to think about. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, so I think
yeah, I was just going to say one more thing that we faced a lot in this past year after scaling. We were in the past just in a handful of schools, and so we were able to remain in contact with students and help them find additional opportunities to engage in their communities after they could finish the curriculum that we are evaluating. But now that we're in more schools, we have to be a lot more intentional, like when we're going into schools, thinking about the ways that we can help students plug in with other organizations that are doing work that might be meaningful to them, so that students don't just get to the end of this curriculum about affordable housing and then say, okay, I don't know how to continue this work once people are gone. So having that kind of exit strategy is important for us.
This is Ray. I would just chime in and talk a little bit about working directly with schools. So most of my work has been more at the school level than the district level. And to echo Jean's sentiment, whether it's the district or the school, building relationships is really crucial because of the turnover issue. In Chicago, there's constant turnover of principals and teachers, and that's really one of the biggest challenges that I've faced. In addition to that, I would say, from my perspective at least, from in a community psychology approach, we all have ideas about what we think works or what might work, or our perspective on programs that we think are valuable. But one of the things that I've always tried to do as much as possible is try to go in with an open mind and listen to the perspective of the folks at the school and what they want. Obviously a basic tenet of community psych, but harder to do in practice sometimes, especially if a school is not highly functional and not necessarily sure of what they want or need. But having conversations over time and in the process, building relationships and listening and finding out, what's going on here, what do you think you need, and then how can we work together to try to address that is an approach that I've tried to take.
I would also add that another place where you can maybe get a better understanding of how community members and people that work tangentially within the school district feel about certain topics or issues is by joining the school district's advisory committees. For example, I'm a part of the School Health Advisory Committee in Miami-Dade County, and I have much more of a pulse on what's going on in the schools and how community members and people that work in the schools, both employed by the school district and who have contracts within the school district, feel about health issues that are currently going on.
I think these are really great strategies as we're kind of thinking about how do you build those relationships and kind of gain entry into having conversations with folks. And so I really appreciate the conversation and the suggestions people are throwing with regards to this. That was I was trying to think of thinking about kind of different strategies for gaining entry. And I think that was hearing folks kind of have that conversation as well about how different strategies for gaining entry into these school sites, especially after we recognize that this has been students are historically underserved, or they might be overstudied, or there's high turnover within these sites. What are kind of the best ways to kind of begin to build entry into these sites? And so I have like kind of 3 general strategies that I've been thinking about with regards to building entry, but I'm really kind of curious what other folks' thoughts are on this. So like the first one, when I was thinking about the different partnerships I've had over time, the first one I thought was more of like a bottom-up strategy. So finding a champion or kind of a gatekeeper that's interested in research or challenging particular current practices. So currently in South Carolina, I'm working with a teacher who's also a magnet teacher for the English department within the high school. And she is doing action research and wants to do civic agency with students. And so she's we're kind of just working right now together, kind of beginning to get to know each other and think about how we can think about different projects. But it was just sort of a champion within the school system who has a lot of leverages and is able to get meetings with the superintendent, get meetings with the principal, get meetings with the school board to kind of begin to think about how do we move the needle that way. And is very active in the teachers union and kind of is doing all this alternative curriculum. And so I've found that one entryway is sometimes just building kind of initial partnerships with champions within those settings that are already kind of doing the work, and there's kind of shared values and reciprocity there. Another one that I've done, and also be interested to hear about other people, is more of like a top-down approach. Neither of these approaches are like associated with a negative component to them, right? Just different entryways into a school system. But with a top-down approach, kind of working with school administrators or principals that are who are interested in school reform, new partnerships, incorporating research, mental health into the school system. And some ways to go about doing that I was sort of taught and mentored by was around actually just kind of reading local newspapers and websites about kind of recent kind of discussions they're having around what are their goals for next year. Do they hope to build partnerships with the university? What's on their agenda? And then reaching out that way, because I've kind of been following them and understanding kind of where they're hoping to take the school area and the discipline moving forward. And then the other one was alternative settings that I've worked in. So these are kind of spaces that are interested in new programs, practices, and supporting students both within and outside the school. So some of these are out of school time settings, as well as nonprofits that are offering school courses within the school day. So that was a really big one with regards to working with the San Francisco School District. Be interested to hear Gabe's thoughts on this as well. But there are a lot of nonprofits that are really active in kind of providing services outside of school, as well as during the school day. And so partnering with them could also be a point of entry within to kind of work with students within the school. So I'm interested, are these points that resonate with folks? Are there other areas of entry? Some people have already talked about sitting on kind of school boards, which I think is a great point of entry as well. How do folks build partnerships? Do one strategy resonate with them over others?
Yeah, hi, this is Gabe. Another one. My work with San Francisco was maybe a little bit unusual in that they found me and called me and said, "Hey, we're doing this work. Do you want to go in on a grant with us?" Just kind of cold called, because I was one of few people that had written on the type of program that they were doing. And, for me, that was at a point where I was pretty much sick of working in schools and sick of all of the bureaucracy and all of the stuff you have to go through, and had pretty much decided I'm never going to work in schools again. And then I get this call from these cool people in San Francisco who have a great idea and want to develop it and evaluate it and really take it to the next level. And so I said yes. And my thinking at the time was, sweet, this is like all of the things that have frustrated me about trying to get entry into schools and maintain the project or the program or whatever, were solved. And and part of what I learned was that that's true to an extent, but schools and districts are very complex things that have a lot of moving parts. And so, similar to what Jean was saying, having an in doesn't mean you really have an in. You really need to think broadly about how the partnership is working, how it is influencing or being influenced by some of the other parts of schools and districts and whatever. So we've always made a lot of effort to talk with people at schools, administrators, teachers, counselors, etc., and talk with people in administration, going to the district offices and making sure that people in the superintendent's office know who we are and what we're doing, and make sure people in the research office know who we are and what we're doing, and figure out like what types of things can we do that fit their needs and their goals, so that they'll be open to hearing when we have needs and goals too that we need support for.
I would just add too that one of the things that I've found helpful here in Cleveland, this is Adam, is I think it kind of blends what you described, Mariah, as top-down and alternative settings. But I found that in a lot of big districts, there are almost like these different alternative settings, to use your language, within the district that focus on different topical areas. So the work that I do concerns school climate and student engagement, including YPAR. And so when I got to Cleveland, I really did want to take the approach that that you're always trained to take in community psychology, where you go in and you ask questions and you see what the needs of the community are. And I do think that that's a really important strategy. But in some cases, depending on who you talk to, the answer to the question as to what do you need or what do you want to know might not really align with your areas of expertise or training, or if you're an academic, with your sort of research program. So if a district's big enough, I've found that oftentimes if you kind of look hard enough, you might find somebody who's kind of responsible for your content area, so to speak. So in Cleveland, for example, the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, they have an office that is staffed by, I think, 3 or 4 people that's devoted just to social and emotional learning. And so I found that group to be really receptive to some of my ideas, and to be asking the same kind of questions just within their own intergroup processes, the same kind of questions that I was interested in getting the answers to as a researcher. we've developed a pretty good collaboration. And I think it helped that there was this sort of overlap in terms of our topical interests.
One of the districts we partner with also has a similar group, and it's called the Office of School Culture. So we found that that's a good way of like getting into working with the schools, because it's like the school district focuses on all the academic stuff, and the Office of School Culture is anything that's not academic. So we found that they're a good partner.
So there's a couple of chat comments too. So Tracy said that I'm doing a lot of simple hanging out in schools, just trying to let them get to know me and understand that I'm not a threat. And Jamie said that I just wrote a development grant focused on the transition to middle school. I found a local transition to middle school talk for parents of 5th grade elementary students, attended, introduced myself to the principals that gave the talk, and started a relationship. I think finding local events like that are great ways to meet school-based folks in person and helps kickstart those relationships.
Yeah, I think folks are kind of talking about kind of understanding where's their niche within the school, like who are individuals that have kind of shared values or shared goals or objectives, and that they could be in very different contexts throughout the school environment, in alternative spaces, within specific kind of departments, or different units within the school. So I think it's really interesting to hear about everyone's strategies here, and kind of really kind of just looking for folks that have a similar kind of desire and background, but also this idea within community psych of what can we do for you? How can we be beneficial? What are ways to kind of develop these partnerships? And a lot of times our first ask is how can we be helpful to you, right? Before kind of wanting to push forward our own kind of research interests or objectives here, or at least looking if there's an area where there's convergence there. I think some folks that were already kind of talking about this, but when I was thinking about what are the different ways to build research partnerships, there seems like sometimes there's some small scale beginning initiations of partnerships, and this could be providing services to the district, school, or classroom that I found. So I do a lot around student voice and civic engagement, and so sometimes offering to do lesson plans or co-teach with teachers, just to think through what do these practices look like within the classroom, have been a way to kind of begin an initial partnership. So they're not like necessarily saying, yes, we're starting this whole project, but hey, do you want to come in? Do you want to talk to my students? Can they ask you questions about being a professor? Can you talk to them about research? Just to kind of begin those kind of small scale kind of collaborations to see if there's kind of good relationships going on there, or at a district level being asked to kind of come in and talk to teachers about social emotional learning and civic engagement, and running kind of a small workshop for a district retreat that day. So yeah, so again, like those small asks at first, right? They're not like saying we're going to go do this huge project with you, but me kind of saying, okay, what are you interested in? What are some needs within the school? How can I be a help or a service within this space? And then being able to kind of deliver content or material within those spaces to just begin to develop those partnerships, and to see if there's some real kind of synergy going on within those kind of small asks as well. I don't know if anyone else has kind of examples of that, like when they first started their partnership, did you just go and run a workshop or provide kind of just literature for folks? Just thinking about some of our folks on the call had mentioned earlier that they're starting kind of dissertation work. These small asks were kind of really key for me to build kind of longer term, bigger projects as well.
For our group here in Nashville, we're partnering with a local nonprofit that is kind of comprised of architects and designers and urban planners who have a lot of knowledge of the built environment. And so we kind of start our entry into these research partnerships with PD just around the historical processes that have led to inequity within school districts. So teaching teachers about redlining and block busting and and the impact of like property taxes on gentrification and how this is playing out in the city, and providing them with resources about that, which is essentially what the nonprofit then teaches to students. And so it's a way for teachers to see if this is something they might be interested in. And that PD has been a great way to develop the kind of, because we do kind of use that bottom-up structure to gain teacher support and to get kids to see the curriculum that we're implementing. But either way, it's exciting to know that teachers now kind of at the level of the district have this broad-based knowledge of these historical policies and practices that have created the systems that we're seeing play out today. So that's been a good kind of entry point for us.
That's great to hear. I think some, like when I initially started this type of work, I didn't think that adults needed like the education and support that we're providing to young people. And it was a big kind of learning curve first starting off that like actually the educators or the mentors or the teachers really benefit from the materials and resources too. Like if we're going to be talking about empowering young people, we have to like continue to think about what are empowering like curriculum materials or resources for teachers as well. So I kind of do some similar stuff with teacher professional development workshop, talking about civic engagement, like their own level of civic engagement. How do they engage in their lives too? So that they're also kind of invested in the curriculum as well. So thanks for bringing that up, because I think that's a really interesting insight, but also like that's how you also get that buy-in and support too, right? We're not just like serving students, but everyone in that school ecology as well.
And Mariah, Michelle wrote it in chat saying that after hanging out and starting to develop relationships, I've been asked to facilitate workshops or planning retreats for teachers and parents.
Thanks for that, Adam. I'm like not being able to see the text, I think, with the PowerPoints. I appreciate that. Yeah. That's great to hear too. Yeah, I think, Michelle, you're kind of highlighting some really kind of important points with having those informal conversations, relationship building, and then like those kind of become entry points into these kind of asks at the beginning to kind of begin to support teacher professional development, as well as like staff or counselors or students as well. I was thinking just kind of like on a trajectory of partnerships that like there's the small scale and then the mid scale one. And I like the end goal is maybe the large scale one, which is a collaboration, a grant, a research project with the school. But kind of maybe scaffolding up the partnership, building the partnership over time with these relationships. Something that I try to think about doing is how do I begin to build in research and evaluation into the climate within the school or district. So first it's a small scale ask about like, what can I do? What can be helpful? What can be supportive? And then kind of mid scale is thinking about, well, how do we start using research and evaluation to inform best practices? A really big entry point for me, but I'm interested to what other folks think, are helping folks. A lot of schools are already doing school climate surveys. So really helping them design those surveys or analyze those surveys or start thinking about new questions that could be asked with those surveys seem to be a big entry point into helping them kind of begin to think about, okay, how can research be really helpful in informing our practice? And another thing is like really trying my best to provide kind of feedback in real time to make sure I'm kind of on the schedule of the school and not like the schedule of the university, which always moves slower, or the organization that I'm working within. So I'm interested what other folks do with regards to kind of beginning to start infusing research into the partnership or practice or evaluation.
For me, this is Michelle, that, sorry, I'm using either voice or chat, depending on the noise of my house, but that there, by hanging out, and there was like school councils where teachers and families and others were part of decision making, And so that what happened was by being there, and then they started to have questions, and to be a resource in helping them to develop a survey, for instance, or to use data visualization to understand their data. And so it's kind of that same thing of being there and hanging out, and then and then when questions arose or things they wanted to learn about, then it was being able to start to partner with them in that way.
I've found the whole phenomena of research practice partnerships as a thing the last few years to be a helpful vehicle for talking about this kind of work with school districts. I know we've been really explicit in describing our work with the Cleveland Metro School District here in Cleveland as a research practice partnership. And we've educated the district on what that means. And they've given us ideas of what they'd like it to mean for them. And I think that I found that to just be an incredibly useful movement in the education research world, this RPP thing, because there, it's like legitimated with all of this writing that's been done on it, and the examples of other RPPs around the country, and this national network of ed research practice partnerships that's been established for the last few years. So I found that to be really useful. And under the umbrella of our RPP, we've actually kind of had formal research agenda setting workshops with stakeholders from the district and from the community. We've formally established a steering committee made up of stakeholders at the district and from some other entities, and we meet once per year to formally establish a research agenda or tweak it, as may be the case if the questions haven't been answered in the course of the past year. So that took a while to get to that point. That wasn't something that we tried to do in the first month of approaching the relationship with the district, but we've worked up to that, and we have a pretty good framework in place right now. But I'm thinking back to one of the first conversations that I had with the SEL department in Cleveland, and I think from the very beginning we did kind of start with research, but kept it very simple, and just in terms of asking what they needed to know. I think one of the early questions was just what do you need to know in your office in order to kind of accomplish your goals to the extent that you'd like. What kind of knowledge would help you get there? And we tried to kind of parlay some of the answers to those questions into research questions, and that helped us get off to a good start.
This is Ray again. I would just chime in and say that I think one of the most important issues, at least working at the school level, is the extent to which they're interested in the research side of things. Clearly, we are, of course. A lot of times, at least in the schools in Chicago that I worked with, they're just trying to sort of keep the train on the tracks, if you will, and keep things going day to day. And in addition, there's a lot of schools, of course, as we all know, that historically have not had good experiences with researchers and have often been exploited for their, opportunity for researchers to come in and collect data. And, we get our publications and we get our tenure, but then in a couple of years, they're gone. And so that has, left a bad taste in a lot of mouths of some schools and districts where research actually puts up a red flag. And if they hear that too early, that might actually, make them suspicious or want to know, well, what is your actual motivation for working here? Is this so you can get your data, or are you actually interested in helping us improve? So it's really, I think, a matter of listening and being in tune with what either the school or the district wants. I think districts are probably much more amenable to talking about research and looking at data. I think that for some schools, like those I've described, that might be down the line, and I usually don't even bring that up too early on. I really try to focus more on, what does the school need and what could the school, what benefits could be found from participating and working with me or working in some kind of community-based project.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think anytime you can, excuse me, try to align what you're doing and listen to those things that they're having challenges with, and say well, if we work towards this, this is how this work can hopefully make your lives easier or make things flow better in your district. Or I think that's the kind of approach that we try to do here.
Yeah, I also think it's helpful. Really appreciate the points being raised. I think it's helpful to also think about how are people defining research. Is, you know, sometimes I think sometimes having conversations with schools, the definition of research is, oh, well, this person comes in, they do their intervention, and they leave, and so that's their idea of what research is. Not that research can be used to inform their school practice or policy, because that's how, like, historically research has been used. And so I think, you know, having these conversations around what questions do you have? Okay, well, that's like, that is a research question, or that is an evaluation question. Let's talk about what data we could gather to collect this to inform, you know, your practice, begins to kind of shift the narrative of how we even think about research. But like recognizing, again, like going back to that history of like, well, how has it been used in the past? And so, yeah, I think the language when we initiate these initial partnerships is so critical, right? Because there are loaded words that we think are positively like tied to best practices and like informed like change within organizations. And yet that can be very loaded within that community around like, what has that been defined in the past, and research onto us rather than research with us or in collaboration with us. So I think those are really important points to be raised. Like when you have these initial conversations, are we using the same terminology? What do we mean by that? And the research practice partnership literature, I think, does a really good job about trying to also kind of, how do we like have those common agendas and narratives too? That's been kind of really emerging within the education literature, but I think there's a lot of kind of echoes with what we've kind of also know in community psychology as well. So I thought maybe before, I think our initial conversation with like a group of 4 or 5 of us was like wanting to talk about, well, how do we start thinking about student voice within schools? And that was like an area of interest for some of us within that core group. But I also want to respect that we have, and I'm so excited that we have such a large group today. Do folks want to talk about that, or would we want to spend some time just talking about barriers or challenges to this type of work? Challenges that folks have been kind of encountering, or strategies for engaging in partnerships. Just want to be mindful of how we use the last 10 minutes to have a conversation.
And someone from the chat has asked if anyone is connected with schools through an office such as the mayor's office to conduct research or establish a partnership. Maybe not, but it sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I don't have much to comment on that yet, but we did start, there's like some initial conversations with the mayor's office and a representative around like some school reform ideas. And that's been a new partnership. I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but it's definitely, because it feels like folks that kind of are interested in kind of student leadership and agency at like a city level. So I have been having initial conversations. So I'd be interested in folks, if other folks have had those initial conversations around that as well. Okay. Well, so Sarah and Adam, what do you think? Should we chat about student voice, or would you like to maybe take some time for barriers? What were your initial thoughts?
Either way is fine to me. We don't have too much time. And I did want to check in on our structure for the next meeting. I don't know if we want to actually establish a time or date, or I can send out another poll. Does that work for folks? Or does this time work? I guess if you have preferences, you can maybe put them in the chat.
You know, with this time, you're really restricting participation on the West.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And Michelle and I are here from Mountain Time, but I'm not sure if anybody else is.
I think Megan called us from Sacramento, so she wins the earliest, earliest in the morning participation. But I guess too, just with the little time we have left, Mariah, I was wondering if folks had any ideas as well about kind of the structure of the interest group calls going forward. Like Sarah said, I mean, people can offer ideas in chat or via email following up, but we had a conversation last month that led to Mariah's presentation today, and that we thought it might be nice to use time during our monthly calls to just kind of talk about an issue that a lot of us are grappling with in our work as community psychologists with schools and in schools. So that was what we settled on last month, but I mean, I think that we want to make sure that the membership of the interest group has a lot of say in how we use this time, or if folks want to have calls at all. And we're all very, very open to ideas.
I think the issue focus is a good one. Another way to go might be trading off on some of us maybe sharing our experiences, whether it's a particular project or maybe a couple of projects over time, just different ways to get at, I'm guessing, similar issues. But that's another option to consider as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just to share also from our last conversation, another thing we had talked about was down the line, like generating like a special issue or some article kind of talking about the role of community psychology within school settings or spaces. And we talked about, is that something in AJCP? Is that a policy paper that Jean was telling us about? Or is that maybe sharing that in a traditional maybe education journal? Around the role of community psychologists. And we thought that might, I think, form organically from the conversations we're having around projects and similar themes. But just wanted to throw that out there as something that we had mulled over last time as well.
Does anyone have any thoughts on whether it's like an experience or an issue that they would be willing to share? Does anyone want to volunteer themselves? If not, that's fine. Or even volunteer ideas, really.
I know I'm just an observer more than a member of the group, but I would really be interested in hearing about serious successes where people felt that their work really helped to change school climate in significant ways, and how the school operated. I think that could be fascinating.
Yeah.
Or even what evidence you have to suggest that happened. Yeah, I would be really interested in hearing how folks have kind of researched and measured those types of policy and program level outcomes of their work. That's a huge challenge for the research practice partnership literature right now.
Yeah, that would be part of it, is like, how do you know? How do you know?
And also just to add to that, if there's like new methodologies that people are playing with on thinking about this, like how do we define success, but then like what are the methods that we use to that? I've been really interested in how we use social network analysis to think about how relationships and information flow changes over time. So it thinks just kind of other ideas as well with regards to that. I am also looking at the window that people have some suggestions as well. Are folks able to kind of read those, or?
Yeah, I see a lot of talk about student voice and parent voice being important topics for discussion. Discussing experiences.
And Gabe also wrote that he's an action editor at JCP, and they're very open to a special issue as well. So thanks for raising that.
I said this last week too during our call, or last month, excuse me. But I feel like the time is really right for community psychologists to kind of seize this moment where research practice partnerships, at least in the ed research world, are becoming a big thing. I feel like having spent a considerable amount of time in conversations with folks who are doing that work, it seems like it's being driven a lot by folks who are kind of quantitative education researchers by background and training. And they're kind of stumbling around trying to figure out how to do all the partnership relationship building aspects of this model of work. And I just think that community psych has so much to offer there. There's a real opportunity for community psychology to kind of, seize some of the space in the RPP world, the research practice partnership world, with our expertise in doing participatory research and the values that we bring with that.
Yeah, I went to a talk at AERA about RPPs, and I didn't really actually know that term until that time. And it was very different than what I was expecting, I would say, because they just come at it from a different lens from the ed world. And I think to the extent to which we can bridge that gap, I think we could be really successful.
So it sounds like we might have a paper on our hands, or at least something to start exploring. I mean, is it a possibility that maybe we come back when we meet next time, ready to kind of talk about how we see our own work as being either like part of a research practice partnership, or aligned with or not aligned with the kind of traditional frames of research practice partnerships that we're seeing in the ed literature, and just talking about that a little bit as a way to think through, like, maybe this is something I'm seeing there's like a bunch of stuff in the chat about this, so I'm gonna hush, but yeah, maybe we talk about this next time.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot, personally.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And Gabe made the good point too, that a couple of community psychologists at the W2 Grant Foundation in particular have been pretty active in writing about RPPs, Ed Trickett and Vivian Seng. So I temper my previous comment that suggested that community psychology hasn't been part of the conversation up to now.
Yeah, so I think to end the call, I mean, Adam and I can definitely take these ideas that we've talked about and just work towards setting a time for our next call where we further explore like research practice partnerships. And I hope that others can feel comfortable at least sharing a little piece of their work, even if they don't want to prepare a whole PowerPoint or a full discussion. If they feel comfortable sharing how they have a research practice partnership or not, we can kind of provide some guiding questions or talking points to guide that next group. And then I hope everyone is on the SCRA listserv, because that's, I think, the group that I'll send the when to meet poll, so we can decide our next meeting sometime in November. I think that's pretty much it for today. I know it's 11 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of people's time.
And if you're not on the listserv, just email me and let me know.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hopefully we'll see you again or hear from you again next month.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all
so much for coordinating this.